Welcome to Siliconsciousness, the DSR Network podcast focusing on the artificial intelligence revolution, politics, and policy.
Hello and welcome to Siliconsciousness. I'm David Rothkopf, and today, this week, as we do every week, we're going to take a look at an important dimension of the AI revolution and related technological revolutions that are taking place. This week, we're extremely fortunate to have with us as a guest Michelle De Mooy. She is the director of the Tech and Public Policy program at the Georgetown University McCourt School of Public Policy. She's a leader in tech policy focused on ensuring that emerging technologies advance human rights and democratic values. Oh, those are such old-fashioned values. Hi, Michelle. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure.
Well, we'll get into some of that because I thought the best way to kick this off would be to talk a little bit about the big AI policy news of the week. Yesterday, President Trump announced his three-part AI action plan, which focused on, I think, three things really: getting rid of regulations so people can, innovate,
right.
pumping money into that innovation, and making sure that innovation doesn't lead us in any dangerously woke directions. And we can explore each one of those. But first, perhaps your overall reaction to what you saw yesterday.
My overall reaction, I go into those things sort of like with this tense nervousness, right? Maybe a lot of people do because you just never know, right? It's like this joke that John Mulaney said about the horse in the hospital, the horse being loose in the hospital. He had this bit about Trump. He said, the horse is loose in the hospital and you don't know what's going to happen. That's kind of how I felt. I think I came away from it thinking that he was using, mostly I felt like he was using the federal government as a cudgel, which is often what is done. There were some things, there's some things I liked in it. There were a lot of things I did not like in it. So I think that was my overall takeaway. The cudgel was, using federal funding to get what he wants, what the administration wants, which is no, state regulation on AI to get the agencies, what's left of them, in line in terms of not passing regulation or rules related to AI. And that's the FTC, the EPA, NIST, kind of getting everybody in step, even when Congress has not acted on like the state moratorium on AI laws. So it was a cudgel in many ways is kind of what I came away with.
Well, I get a kind of a little bit of a schizophrenic vibe from the administration, right? And from the Republican Party. So on the one hand, remember that, this is the Republican Party that tried to get into their big bill, no state regulation of AI, right? That didn't stick. But, that's a general theme. And the guy at the right hand of the president on this tech stuff, David Sachs, seems to be a big proponent of as little regulation as possible.
Yeah.
Meanwhile, there do seem to be pockets in the administration that are saying, well, let's be careful about who we give big chipsets to. Let's be, so there is a bit of a tug of war. Do you perceive that as well?
Yeah, definitely. I think in general, there's agreement on being pro-industry. I think for the most part. But yeah, there's differences, I think, in terms of what they think is pro-competitive and what is not, right? And certainly I think on the idea of how to compete against China, what the export rules should be, how we approach semiconductors. I think that there's for sure differences, and in Congress too. And though, people, congressmen have written about this, and inside the administration, I think there are differences. But I think David Sachs has a lot of power. I think he was definitely represented in this document. You saw a lot of that, I think, with the removing of, the state law, or basically using the federal funding to remove those, and the environmental fast tracking of data centers and semiconductor. I think a lot of that was him. But I think the administration, I met with some European leaders recently, and one of the things they asked me was, it appears really chaotic and confused from the outside, the administration's viewpoints on tech policy, but I'm sure it's not that. Can you tell us what's going on? I said, no, it is. It is. Chaotic and confused.
Exactly.
It really is just sort of case by case, and whatever sort of the moment demands in terms of what will be the more dominant. What can I use in this moment to get what I want? So it'll be pro tech and then not pro tech. So I think that's
well, it's partially chaotic because maybe what they want is not what they think they want, or maybe what they think they want is not what they want. An example is, let's take power generation for data centers. So, the administration comes in with Trump's drill, baby, drill. Let's just, if you can use coal, that's better than using clean gas, which is better than using solar. But if you could use dirty coal, even that would be better. There's a kind of an impulse in that regard. But the same token, solar and wind are cheaper.
Right.
And so what happened was they started promoting this, and all of a sudden some big red states like Texas were calling them up going, guys, we can't afford this other stuff. Please don't tune us out. So maybe the market is serving as a kind of control there, in not the way they expected it to.
Right. And I think that's true with AI too, in the sense that, and actually in any technology, they sort of trot out innovation writ large as the argument, but when there are regulations, usually it's actually good for the market, right? It creates this kind of stability, it reduces risk and fraud, so a same type of thing where they're sort of constantly trying to deregulate, but usually that's not good for the market. That's not good. It's certainly not good for the bigger players. When there's regulation, the smaller players tend to have trouble with compliance, right? So there are a lot of ways in which this is, schizophrenic, as you put it, not always achieving, what they think they're achieving.
I think we've gone through several phases of this, and because AI is fairly new, they've all happened, it seems like, in the past couple of weeks, but it's actually been the past couple of years.
Yeah.
And so one phase, which was sort of 4 years ago and before, was the tech people didn't want to have anything to do with Washington.
Right.
They just stayed out. And then they said, oh, well, this could be a problem. We may need to get involved. And so then the second phase was what I call kind of the head fake phase, where they said, Washington, you've really got to focus on not having AI destroy the world. That's the thing you should focus on. Don't worry about this other stuff. We've got that, right? Right. Which was kind of, it was kind of a fake. Then they've gone into this new period where sort of Trump has come in and said, well, what do you want? And a lot of the big characters from the industry are close to him. And all of a sudden they can't believe their good fortune. And there are a bunch of them going, no regulation. Just leave us alone. And because but the problem is that has never worked in any industry in the history of the world, because there's always an issue, right? Whether it's national security or whether it's safety or whether it's environmental and health. So it seems to me we're on the verge of, no, you can't have this, you can't have the whole cake. We've got to find something more rational, but we're not quite there yet. First of all, do you think my description there is roughly the way it is?
I think that's exactly right. And, it's the same thing that happened with social media, with privacy, right? And it's a mistake. And we know that. And yet, it keeps happening because of these political battles, and the companies continue to consolidate so much money and so much lobbying power that it creates these kind of stalemates. And it isn't good for the market. It's not good for the companies. It's not good for the people, right? And yet here we are. I think that your analysis is exactly right. And it's frustrating to watch this happen every time. And then over time, we see the problems, we see the harms, we start to gather more and more evidence about this. And, I think the more that we allow the companies, especially on AI, to gather power over this and say, no, look at this shiny thing over here about, these robots coming and killing us all, while we actually consolidate power over here, which is always what they do. That's where we start to miss that. We start to miss the importance of how they're doing it, why they're doing it, going into communities and buying up land, getting Trump to remove permitting and zoning, challenges and issues that are the only thing really stopping them in a lot of those cases. Those are big mistakes. Those are really big mistakes that would actually be helpful as far as slowing them down a little bit. And so what happens is states jump in to fill the vacuum like they did on privacy, right? They continue to do. And there is actual innovation in some ways. It's interesting. States have really innovated on AI laws. They've taken really different approaches. You see these different governance models. And that's kind of interesting to watch. Of course, they hate it, but it's sort of an interesting thing to watch. But really what happens is we get left behind in the global conversation, because you have the EU has already is putting its laws into effect. You have China has laws, Japan, everywhere. They're building this governance framework around AI, and we have nothing. We have no coherence, really.
I think it's a really critical point, and essentially that it's AI policymaking, like nature abhors a vacuum. Mm-hmm. And so what happens is, if the federal government says we're not going to do it, mm-hmm. states and localities say, well, we've got to do it, and international other nations say they've got to do it, and so we end up not being at the table. Now, what Trump tried to say yesterday and tried to use as leverage said, states, I don't want you to do this. But there are going to be a lot of states. I mean, California's just had a new initiative, and they're even proliferating city level initiatives that for a variety of reasons, they're going to push back, and they're going to say, no, we're going to do it our way. And from a regulatory point of view, I used to be a trade official back in the olden days, and our job was to harmonize regulations, right? Because otherwise you couldn't get scale. And so it seems to me is we could end up with a checkerboard of regulations across the US, which will actually impede getting to scale. And the only way, saying no regs is not the answer. There has to be some kind of actual effort at harmonization.
Definitely. I think you're exactly right. And, that has happened on privacy, for example. There has been very, interesting laws across the states, and sometimes they'll copy each other. So there's a little bit of harmony, but really there isn't, and it frustrates the companies, which is understandable. But every time it gets to a place where it can be a federal law, these issues, federal preemption becomes a problem, or the private right of action becomes a problem. And, there are solutions. There are ways to come to the same place, with some compromise, but it just never happens. And I think that's really unfortunate, because there doesn't seem to be that voice in Congress anymore, or that sort of path towards compromise. And on AI, it feels like the stakes are so much bigger. I mean, privacy is a part of that, but the stakes are really huge. And I've heard from global partners in Singapore and Japan and lots of places just how important it is that the US has lost ground here. That we are no longer, not just, in the various ways that this has happened with tariffs and free speech, et cetera, but just that we are no longer a governance thought leader, that we are not that standard for human rights, for, some other aspects of governance is a really big deal. And, so I think there's still this hope that we will come to the table at some point. But I don't think I can stress enough how much that is disturbing to our allies.
It looks like we're, operating under the Churchillian formula of perhaps getting to the right answer, but only after having exhausted all the other options, right?
Right, like everything will fall apart, right? And then we'll kind of crawl to the table. Yeah, that's not ideal.
Well, let me take two of those, because two of the areas where Some places in the world are dealing with it, but we don't apparently want to. Um, uh, what one is yesterday, Trump was talking about intellectual property, and he was like saying, "Well, it's just not." I mean, as if he'd actually thought this through, right? But he said, "Well, it's just not practical to go and when you're training large language models, you know, uh, give some rights to the people whose content you're using to train them." And I'm sure he hasn't thought that through. I'm sure
Yeah.
somebody told him that. But if the administration's position is we're entering a new era in the age of intellectual property, where if you're using the IP in AI, you don't own it anymore. Which doesn't seem. I mean, to me, that seems not feasible. Contrary to the opposite of what he said. What do you think?
Yeah, I didn't understand. Yeah, I mean, I don't think the position was articulated in that sense, and I don't really feel like the administration has taken one on this. But I'm not sure. I could be wrong. I'm not an expert in intellectual property, but I agree with you that this is such an important issue, and there's really been no thought leadership at all on this, and I think all we've seen is basically pro industry, right? So whatever that looks like, which is, pro kind of litigation, pro Google, right? Pro just kind of coming after and protecting the LLMs at all cost, right? So the lack of really digging into the sort of complexity of these cases, the Google search case, et cetera, the New York Times. So I don't, I can't, the only thing I can say, I think, in terms of the stakes, I think, are really huge. Whether or not these training data sets are proprietary, the information in them will basically make or break this industry, right? And yet you hear nothing from the administration about it.
Well, it also poses a new kind of question, right? Which is the meta IP question. And I'm not referring to the company, although I could be. And the meta IP question is this: LLMs or other kinds of AI models train themselves on all the work of all the artists in history, all the writers in history, and they create something which then future AI could train itself on. Who owns that? Who owns the product of the brain of ChatGPT or I mean, we're getting into pretty sophisticated AI produced animations and CGI and all this other kind of stuff. If you're taking industry side, presumably, if your company is developing that stuff, you want to own it, even though you stole all of the component parts of it. I don't know. It seems like a tension to me.
I think it's a really tricky question, right? I mean, because at what point does it become something new is at the heart of all of it. The common was it's when is it other people's, and then when does it become something new? Because it does become something new at a certain point, right? It does when the LLM has ingested enough data, it turns it into, the courts have said, and I think it's fair to say, something different. Right? When you see the LLMs create, I don't know, maybe art is the best way, or a new piece of music, or whatever, it does, at least according to the courts, and something different. And so I think that is the tension: is when does that happen? And of course, we don't understand much about these models at all. To be able to look at any kind of moment in them is impossible. So that's a big part of it too. So we just look at what we do understand, which is these training sets and the weights, and trying to figure out where we could sort of pinpoint something. And so all of it is in a way ridiculous. It's I think almost impossible for us to do that. So the courts are left with sort of incomplete knowledge about this almost mystical system that even its engineers don't understand, trying to answer this really complicated legal and technical question. I mean, I think what it's going to come down to, and in an evolving system at the same time, so it's kind of chasing something that's constantly changing. I think it's going to come down to, basically it's going to have to evolve with it. It's going to have to be sort of, there are times when it is this and times when it is not this, and that will change. And, I think the law is very uncomfortable with that type of thing. Policy is very uncomfortable with that type of situation. It's circumstantial, basically. When there's a circumstance in which it is and when it isn't. I think that's it's very difficult for law and policy to handle those.
Well, it's also difficult for somebody in your line of work, right? Because you're trying to train people in public policy about something where the people who are creating it don't know how it works. And so it's so I mean, it's bad enough that, we have a Congress full of people, a tiny fraction of whom have the ability to use the right vocabulary here.
Right.
But, I see it. I mean, you see it in AI, but I also see it in AI powered things like crypto, where the administration is diving in with both feet. And it's like, yeah, crypto, let's go. Let's put all our money in this. And people don't even understand how these markets work. Yeah. There are assertions made about crypto markets like, you can always unload what you've got, which doesn't actually seem to be true.
Right.
Right.
Yes.
And it's like, how do you regulate something when the people who are supposed to be doing the regulating aren't up to it? This podcast is underwritten in part by the U.S. Embassy of the United Arab Emirates. Its editorial content is completely independent, and the views expressed are exclusively those of participating experts. It is presented live, without editing. For further information about the UAE's efforts in the areas of artificial intelligence and technology, go to the website of the embassy at www.uae-embassy.org and search for UAE-US Tech Cooperation. We thank them for their support. We thank everybody who's supporting this podcast for their support, and we look forward to it developing and growing over time because the issue is so important.
I think, and it's even more basic than that. A lot of times it's explaining the difference between AI and Gen AI, right? I think I've had that conversation quite a bit. Just having those sort of really basic understanding, because I actually don't know if the policymakers really need to understand really the deeply complex technical component to all of it, but some basic stuff, yes. And their staff, yes. Right. I think that is pretty important, and also how to use it in their own work. I think that's a really good way to help them do that. We're doing some trainings for congressional staff, but the way that I approach that for future policymakers, right, at Georgetown, is I put them in this program where it's international and they're with an international group of other students, and I make them deal with a very difficult problem. So the last time we did quantum communications, and they're complaining, they're saying, but this is really nobody really understands quantum or what it is or how to deal with it. How are we supposed to come up with something about it? And I say, yes, exactly. This is what it is. This is what that doing policy in this is sort of the 21st century challenge. And this is why you need to be trained in how to think about this, how to create a framework out of something so uncertain and changing. And, you can do that. But yeah, there's a certain amount of sort of basic technical understanding that has to be there.
Well, I used to be the editor of Foreign Policy magazine, and we would go and do studies of different kinds about, what people were teaching in schools of public policy, right? And so, yeah, well, but one of the things that one of the ones that I did, and it was 8-9 years ago, but it was two things actually, just to give you a sense of what it was. One was, are schools of public policy teaching and requiring ethics discussions? Mm-hmm. Guess what the answer to that is? And the other was, are they teaching and requiring the kind of basic technological know-how that will enable somebody to speak or even read and understand. And the analogy I used to give was, in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, if you wanted to go into foreign policy, you had to speak nuke. You had to know the language of nuclear weapons, throw weights, those kind of things. Otherwise, you weren't let into the room. What's very clear, this stuff is actually much more important, because it's not just foreign policy, it's economic policy, it's social policy, it's privacy, it's everything, right?
Yeah.
But are schools requiring it? Are schools saying, no, you have to learn this before we will let you out of here?
I think it's starting to be that, but it's not completely that, right? It's not every school. It's more in bits and pieces. They're starting to see that so I would say many colleges have some component of it. Whereas in my opinion, it should be a part of every class, because if you think about technology, there really is no component, there's no place in life in which it doesn't touch. It's very difficult to find a part of our lives in which it's not touching. And it's not that you need to be an expert, or you have to sort of put technology over something where it's not necessary. It's just about putting it in context. And if you're a policymaker, that's your job, right? Is to have context and understanding, and to be able to have different scenarios in your mind about people and communities and the larger context. So I think universities have been, they're slow-moving institutions, and they have been slow-moving in this space, I think. I will say, I think one of the biggest components that, at least in tech and public policy, that the approach that I've taken is to look at the program as kind of an incubator. I have a background in industry and in civil society and now in academia. And so I think of my program as this little incubator of almost like experiments, right? So let's try this. Let's try this program in AI Policy Lab, which a lot of people do, but let's see if this produces some interesting work, right? Let's see if we can do something here. Let's try this idea of putting students, like I mentioned, in a situation abroad with other students to learn how to make policy around difficult subjects. Let's try this, so like various different programs, and also integrating with the curriculum at Georgetown to try to kind of have this action-oriented knowledge base around technology that builds in things like ethics, that builds in this much more nuanced understanding of how technology is embedded into policy, et cetera. So I think there's a practitioner-led model that sort of institutions are starting to see is really important. In the past, it's been faculty-led, and while that's great and I think important, I just see this sort of different model emerging that I think should emerge. And it's where you have kind of the doers, the people who are bridge makers between different disciplines. The way it is often in technology, you have this kind of multidisciplinary approach. It's a little faster. It's kind of this rapid response research that can help policy more directly. And of course, you still have the longer research. That's super important too. But that's what I mean by the incubator kind of approach. So this rapid response, this kind of the sandbox as part of it. I think those are important, and we've been doing that at Georgetown. And having all of those things happening at once as a part of this kind of ecosystem that you build at a school, I think that model needs to happen at more schools. And you'll still see kind of at the schools like Harvard and MIT and Stanford, they have amazing programs, but they're not always integrated in this way, where they're all kind of orbiting around this center of a practitioner-led kind of program, somebody who's building those bridges where the students are getting hands-on real training. So another example would be, we had a policy hackathon with Anthropic. And that was so valuable to the students, because they basically had to break a new model of Claude, right? So, which they did in like 10 seconds. I remember Anthropic being concerned, would they be able to break it with prompts? And they broke it in like 10 seconds. But the value of having that interaction, with these engineers from Anthropic, that kind of stuff is what is needed. and I think is just not as available to a lot of students.
Well, it's also, one of the aspects of this particular era that we're entering into, and one of the aspects of AI that we talk about a lot here is its ubiquitousness. That AI is not a vertical; it's horizontal. It's in everything, right?
Yeah, yeah.
But it's in everything. It will be in everything as a black box. It will be a black box in your car. It'll be a black box in your refrigerator. It'll be a black box in your phone. It'll be a black box in every app that you see. And so theoretically, we could just trust that, or we could actually understand what's going on. And so it becomes fundamental to everything in a way that, I don't know, even physics and chemistry weren't as fundamental to everything as this will be from an operational perspective. And I don't think we even know how to teach it. I think it's just happening so rapidly. But I could go on, and we definitely have got to get you to come back. But I'm going to go to one last question here, which is related to this, okay?
Yes.
Because just apropos of what we're talking about, it's taken, I don't know, we can debate it, but like 1,000 years for most universities in the United States and in Europe to stop thinking that only books written by white European men were worth teaching, right? I mean, it's taken
Yes.
a long time, right?
It's taken a while, yeah.
Well, I thought we were making some progress, but I did listen to the president yesterday, and this gets me to my last question, which is, he's like, well, here's the thing: we don't want bias built into these systems, which sounds fine, except that what he really means is that they do want bias built into these systems. And he, in the executive orders that he's signing, one of them is like, well, you can't talk about transgenderism, which, you can't talk about it. It's a bizarre concept, but this idea of saying we will not fund or support woke AI is blazing new territory in fascist suppression of speech. You'll forgive me because I think it's taking us there. Maybe you think I'm overstating it. So
no, I don't. I think it's very, very concerning, and it's the trend of using words and then doing the opposite, right? So he's saying we don't want bias, but we'll be fine with discriminatory conduct. First, I will say the act of asking companies to even do this, I don't really know how they're going to do that. But okay, that aside, yeah, I think it's just this trend of instilling this kind of fear. It's trying to make his base happy, I guess. It's the way in which you create this sort of silencing, right? More and more silencing, which has happened at universities, including at Georgetown, right? They canceled so many grants, so you just create this kind of fear in people, and this continues that. I think the censorship, which I think is exactly what it is, it doesn't matter if it makes sense technically. It doesn't matter if it's something that is going to actually happen at the companies or whatever. It's a way to say we're going to put this out there and we're going to tie money to it and we're going to watch you. Big Brother is going to watch and see, and we will use something if we can just find something, and we'll use it against you, right? I mean, that's kind of what it's about. It's like when Google had the issue with the black Nazis or whatever, and there was a huge uproar. Then Elon Musk has Grok and it's anti-Semitic or something, and nobody, it wasn't a big deal, right, on the right. So, I mean, it's just sort of cherry picking and using this as a kind of political tool, but it's in the name of fascism and censorship. I agree with you.
Well, it's also, there are other dimensions of it. I come from a national security, foreign policy background, and, one of the advantages the United States sold for many years was we have an open society and people have access to all information, and that gives them the tools they need to make better decisions. Yes. And I've heard conversations about AI, in the not too distant past, where people say, well, the Chinese are going to censor their AI, and so their models aren't going to work as well as ours because there's not going to be key stuff in it. Right. Which, by the way, is only partially true because, some of their scientific models may have more data on health in it because we're more concerned about privacy, right? So, but the point is AI and these models work better if you have access to more information.
Right.
And so the more parameters you put that limit what's inside of it being used to shape answers, the less useful it's going to be.
That's very true. That's very true. And do we really want people, these engineers or whomever, to go in there and make these changes? I mean, it's exactly, what a lot of conservatives were saying the companies were doing with content moderation before, related to censoring them on social media. But yeah, I think you're right. It's deciding what is fact and what is fiction. For example, you brought up health. Does this mean now that information about the measles and vaccines is going to be considered woke? How will that be determined, right? And obviously that will be determined by the administration. And that's extremely frightening to think of those terms being defined by sort of conspiracy theories or through political factions. So I think that's a very good point that, they could sort of take words and devalue them, like misinformation and fact, right? So we don't have the same understanding of what those mean anymore.
Well, we don't, most people's memories don't go back so far. I was in the Clinton administration, and I remember going around giving loads of speeches in which we were congratulating ourselves on winning the Cold War and saying that the reason the Soviet Union lost the Cold War was they were denying their people access to information about markets and information about reality. Yeah. And that was an impediment. And yet here we are 30 years later, kind of looking like we're about to do the same thing.
Yeah, I will say this though, and on a positive note, I do know that there are people at companies in DC, all across the country, that are not okay with all of this. And they are smart, driven people, and they are organized. I'll just put it like that. And are not just saying, okay, we're just gonna go with this, and that's not what's happening. So, there are, I guess you could say, pockets of resistance, or at least of differences ideologically, and people who will not allow things to happen. So for me, that's kind of a hopeful thing, not because it's anti-Trump or anti-government or anything like that, but it's just people who believe in the rights that were given to us as Americans. So there are people who stand up for that, and to me that gives me a lot of hope that these orders or whatever they are not just going to be blindly carried out by people. Because at the end of the day, policy is people, right? And so none of this matters unless it's actually carried out. And so we'll see.
Yeah. A good positive note to end on. And it's not just Americans. There are people in other countries who are doing the same thing. And I think it's very important to remember periodically just how early we are in this process. And so, we're gonna discover a lot even in the next few years. And hopefully, as we do, maybe we can invite you back to continue the conversation.
Yeah, this is fun. Thank you so much for having me. It's been really fun to meet you and talk with you.
Same. Thank you very much. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. And we'll be back each and every week here with Scylla Consciousness. We also do our other AI podcast on energy and climate and AI. So follow that one. And of course, everything else we're doing here at the DSR Network, and support us if you can. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.